Underneath by Conway Fitzgerald. Shannon appeared suddenly, like a blinding flash of sunlight flickering through a swiftly passing cloud. Kurt's stomach lurched when he saw her. He was always unprepared to be in her presence, but he was particularly uneasy in such close proximity to her. He could smell her and breathe her in. His heart raced and his pulse quickened, but just as soon as she had come, she had passed him by, continuing gracefully down the hall with her small entourage in tow. Before she entered her classroom, Shannon turned back to have some parting words with her friends. She pulled back her magnificent auburn red hair casually behind her ears until her delicate fingers released it, each strand finding rest neatly upon her shoulders. Kurt's eyes drifted from her hair to her neckline, to her clavicle, which lured his sight further towards her cleavage. Her powdery white face was colored only with the natural soft pink of her blemish-free cheeks. Shannon's alluring hazel eyes were also commanding, yet still warm and inviting. Kurt could see heaven in those eyes. Shannon said goodbye to her friends, and as she entered the doorway, glanced briefly towards Kurt. She then noticed him gawking at her. He was caught in the act. Shannon smirked playfully, then turned away and vanished from his sight. Although it was J.D. Downey Memorial High School that presently occupied most of Kurt's long teen days, his mind was always focused on the future. He fantasized constantly of better days yet to come, because he preferred the promise they offered, rather than the sting and disappointment his reality presented. Fantasy was a beautiful and complete future of his own design. As Kurt meandered lethargically into his early morning biology class, he dreamt of more fantastic days ahead, which included the lovely Shannon Maguire by his side. Her eyes were filled with love and pride for this self-made man she had adored since high school. She kissed his lips and face while congratulating him for a job well done. Kurt's latest movie had just won all the Academy Awards for Best Effin' Everything. Shannon looked so incredible in that short black dress, which hugged her light frame so tightly. Her smile was one of total satisfaction with every aspect of her life. But unfortunately, reality was not as kind to Kurt Davis as were his fantasies, and the rift between those two realms was widening. "Dude!" Kurt glanced up towards the back of the classroom, where he and his friends normally sat. It was Andy Katz and Richie Douglas waving him over like they had seen a ghost. Their eyes were ablaze with excitement. "You are not gonna believe what we have to show you. You've got to see it. Tonight."
"It's gonna blow your mind,"
claimed Richie, smiling widely as he scratched nervously on his ankles. "What? Are you guys tripping?" Kurt asked, unimpressed. He dropped his heavy books upon his desk and sat back lazily, still haunted by his close encounter with Shannon Maguire and the wonderful daydreams that followed in her wake. "No, man." Andy struggled to find the words to explain. He shook his head and reached down again to scratch at his feet. He smiled like he remembered witnessing heaven itself. "Just wait, you'll see. It's unbelievable." "What is?" Kurt demanded, figuring they were talking about some new animated videotape they had watched after smoking some new strain of hydroponic pot with purple hairs in it. Andy waved him off. The science teacher, with his hair greased back and girthy stomach nearly bursting the buttons of his starched white shirt, entered the classroom and scrawled immediately upon the chalkboard. Kurt turned away from them. "Stoners," he said, disappointed. Kurt looked back over to Andy and Richie as they continued to scratch feverishly at their feet and ankles. They were very anxious, like they couldn't wait to go someplace, thus far unmentioned. "Oh, I'm totally infatuated with Shannon Maguire. I must have her," Kurt whispered to them in desperate defiance.
"Oh, dude, her? Isn't she going out with Walter Hartman?"
Richie turned to ask Andy.
Who?
Asked Andy, preoccupied by his feet scratching.
Shannon McGuire.
Richie responded, with more volume than Kurt would have liked. Some of the nearby classmates had taken notice.
Yeah, she's dating that guy who got the basketball scholarship to Duke.
Walter Hartman.
Richie reiterated impatiently.
Yeah, Hartman.
Andy repeated.
Fucking forget about her, man. You've got no chance in hell of ever getting in that girl's pants. Besides, after tonight, I guarantee you'll never think about her again.
Richie said with a confident smile. That thought terrified Kurt. Apparently, these guys had given up the bong for something way too serious for his tastes. He was concerned for them. The frenetic foot and ankle scratching alone was extremely weird.
You guys aren't shooting up or something, are you?
Kurt whispered. His head was leaned towards them.
What?
They both burst out laughing.
Excuse me, Mr. Davis. Mr. Katz?
Interjected the science teacher from across the room.
Do you have something you would like to share with the rest of the class? Not the whole class, just my excellent friend, Kurt,
Andy replied defiantly. Later that afternoon, Kurt had forgotten all about the wild claims of his friends, but he couldn't forget his infatuation with Shannon and the painful notion that she was beyond his reach. These negative thoughts were attaching themselves to the rest of his dreams now, bringing him down. Later, back at home, he looked into the large mirror in his bedroom, searching into his own visage for reassurance. His eyes were filled with passion, but also uncertainty. His bare chest was scrawny and boyish, with pectorals that appeared to sink back into his frame. After the primping failed to satisfy, he returned to his dumbbells and began his third set. When he finished, he exhaled and moved closer to the mirror. Looking for a semblance of progress left him wanting and offered no relief. He couldn't stop thinking about Shannon McGuire and how she soared like an angel beyond his reach. That was a bitter pill for this young American dreamer to swallow. After an uneventful dinner of breaded pork chops, tasteless spinach, and undercooked potatoes, the home phone rang.
Kurt, it's for you. And remember, I want you to do your homework before you play any video games.
His mother yelled from downstairs.
Yeah, Ma, Christ.
He fired back as he reached for the phone.
Yo,
he answered simply.
Hey man, are you ready?
It was Andy.
I don't know, ready for what?
Kurt asked suspiciously.
Pool hopping,
Andy said with joyous anticipation.
It's this awesome pool nearby Richie's house. No one's there, and the water is incredible.
Swimming? Now? Cats, it's like 42 degrees outside. Are you nuts?
Come on, you pussy.
Andy goaded. Kurt did not respond as he searched for a way to tell him no, but Andy persisted.
Dude, I promise you, you will not be disappointed. Just meet us outside Richie's place in like 20 minutes.
Kurt breathed out negatively into the receiver, but once again, Andy insisted.
I guarantee you, Kurt, you'll be glad you did. Trust me. Richie's in 20.
Before Kurt could say no, Andy hung up, and only a dial tone was left. Kurt's interest was now piqued. Andy's attack on his manhood seemed to have worked. Just then, the door to Kurt's room opened.
Who was that?
His mother asked, hovering over the doorway like the sheriff of an Old West town.
It was Andy. He wanted the assignment.
Before he could finish, his mother interrupted.
I hope you don't think you're going anyplace, mister. You got me? It's a school night. And besides, Curtis, you know you really...
Damn it, Mom. Yes, I know.
Kurt yelled back at her defiantly, turning his head away from her. His overworked mother was too tired to fight. She frowned and then closed the door. Kurt was the master of the sneak out. His bedroom window led to a porch which made getting outside without the use of a door quite easy for a 17-year-old boy. Within a few minutes, he had ridden his mountain bike to Richie's street. As he looked for his friends, he noticed several newly posted signs on nearby telephone poles, offering rewards for missing pets. There was a badly photocopied picture of a white cat named Fluffy stapled to one part of the pole, and another of a chihuahua named Amigo that promised a big reward and no questions asked. Kurt imagined the Rottweiler that must have eaten them when Andy yelled out,
Dude, you made it! Excellent!
Andy and Richie emerged from the shadows. Despite the chill of the early spring evening, they were both dressed only in swimming trunks, no shirts or shoes. Their smiling faces were filled with excitement.
Come on, let's go!
They ran down the street joyously, half naked but apparently unaffected by the nearly freezing mid-March weather. Kurt followed cautiously on his bike until they reached their destination. It was a driveway blocked by a wooden wall that had Asian styling and design. Kurt's friends leapt over the fence without hesitation, giggling. Before he could stop them, they were already beyond the fence and entering the courtyard of the strange house. Kurt placed his bike down upon another pole, which displayed yet another poster of a missing pet, a Shih Tzu named Jujai. Kurt traversed the fence, but not nearly with as much alacrity as his friends. He sensed danger and approached with much trepidation. That's when he noticed a large chain attached to a leash without a dog. The bowl of water nearby was filthy, like it hadn't been changed in many days. Kurt could hear Andy and Richie giggling up ahead. They had entered a smaller house near the garage, with an indoor pool inside.
Oh wow, the pool's indoors?
Kurt asked. His friends just smiled. For the first time, as he looked into the water, which steamed with welcoming warmth, he felt a tinge of excitement and intrigue. The light from a hanging lamp reflected upon the water, creating translucent shadow waves upon the ceiling.
Whose house is this?
Mr. Chu's.
Richie answered.
But he hasn't been around for a while. I think he's like with his family in China or something. Don't worry, dude. Nobody's coming. Well, not yet.
As he spoke, Richie removed his swim trunks and then, completely naked, leapt head first into the pool. He turned back to Andy with a big smile and asked,
So who's it gonna be?
I'm thinking Naomi Campbell, Andy proclaimed with a blissful smile. He then followed suit, stripping down and diving in, which made Kurt very uncomfortable, like maybe he didn't know his friends as well as he thought he did.
Come on in, Kurt. The water is great,
Richie said. Soon thereafter, Kurt observed them close their eyes and descend below the surface in an almost trance-like state. Kurt waited silently for about a minute. He looked around the pool house. Then he got up and headed towards the deep end. He could barely make out the shadowy silhouettes of his friends below the surface. Kurt looked over towards the side of the pool. There he saw a large burlap bag with Chinese lettering on it. It read, Hang Soi Imports, Hong Kong, in English. The bag was torn open, with a long stream of dark green moss emerging from it, which appeared to be growing into the pool until it descended into the darkness below. It was then Kurt noticed that a couple of minutes had gone by without his friends re-emerging. Guys! Where the fuck are you? Kurt shouted nervously. The thought that he might need to jump in and save the lives of his foolish, intoxicated friends caused him to strip himself down hurriedly. Just then, Andy came up. He wasn't out of breath. In fact, he seemed almost asleep. He opened his eyes slowly. Kurt berated him. Andy! What the fuck? Where did you go? Come in. Go under. Just keep going. Past the light. To the other side. You'll see. Andy said hauntingly. He then turned and went back down below. Kurt's impulse was to leave immediately, but something about this pool was very attractive to him, almost sexually alluring. Somehow, some way, something good was underneath the water. He could feel it. Kurt stripped down to his underwear and stepped slowly into the pool's staircase. There was a thin layer of soft, gushy moss which caressed his feet. It felt very good. The water was so warm and the air so cold he couldn't wait any longer. He had to enter. He made several more slow, cautious steps and was about waist deep when he saw a flickering light emerging from the bottom of the pool. He hadn't noticed it before, but it was becoming brighter, causing even greater amounts of steam to billow out of the pool. Kurt took a deep breath of air and then looked underneath, towards the light, to see if his best friends were there. The warmth of the water resembled embryonic fluid. Its perfect temperature caused him to tingle all over. He then descended deeper, towards the welcoming light, when he noticed he no longer felt the natural urge to breathe. His lungs seemed replenished with air, but not through his own breathing, but by forces unseen. Kurt was dragged in deeper unconsciously until the surface was no longer in sight. Before him was an orb of warming light, growing bigger as he approached. Kurt was nearly startled into an awakened level of consciousness. He looked up to the blurry surface above the water and then back again towards the light beneath. He then continued towards the light, ever closer. It was a warm, luminous sphere of an almost flesh-like substance that was growing at the bottom of the pool. Kurt pushed his hand into the orb. A force unseen pulled him by his hand into the orb itself. He then passed through the spherical threshold into another place. It was an underworld, a hidden alcove, evidently unconstrained by the known laws of earthly physics. But Kurt was not alone. He saw many shadowy images and what he thought were his friends up ahead. He was pretty sure that he could see Andy sucking face with a beautiful, voluptuous black woman. At first her face was water blurry, but then she became clear to him. She motioned to Andy, who stopped kissing her, to look back at Kurt and smile. The woman was supermodel Naomi Campbell. Kurt couldn't believe his eyes. That's when his idol, David Bowie, reached out for him. He was smoking a joint and passed it over to Kurt. Kurt took a drag and spoke, but neither he nor his rock idol required any words to be heard.
David Bowie. I always said it would be the coolest thing ever to smoke a joint with David Bowie. And here you are.
Bowie smiled back with his mist-colored eyes, but said nothing. Then Kurt noticed her. Shannon was resting alone a short distance away. David Bowie motioned for Kurt to go to her, and he was quickly out of sight. Kurt approached Shannon slowly. His heartbeat raced, his mind filled with doubt over what to say.
Hi, I'm Kurt. I saw you in school today.
I know.
She replied with a smile.
I caught you looking at me.
Before Kurt could offer an excuse or denial, Shannon came closer, reached her hands out to his face, and then pressed her lips up to his. After a long, warm, and breathtaking kiss, she lured him away by the hand into another private area nearby.
Is this a dream? What is this place?
Kurt asked.
You're here. I'm here. That's all that matters.
She said as she started undressing. Her figure was much fuller than what Kurt remembered. Her breasts and hips were more akin to a Playboy playmate than a 17-year-old girl. But she was irresistible and naked and offering herself to him fully. Kurt had fantasized often about his first time and what it would be like, but he never could have dreamed it would be like this. She removed his underwear before he could remain shy. She fell to her knees and filleted him. He was astonished by the sensation, something he had only dreamed about. She came back up and kissed him deeply. He then entered her effortlessly. The feeling was electrifying. After a few minutes of this incredible intercourse, which brought him to incomparable euphoria, he ejaculated. It was then as if this whole underworld beneath the water came along with him. There was a howling, underwater roar audible, a group climax that drew every ounce of sexual energy and inspiration from Kurt's body. Suddenly, Kurt felt his lungs burning, and with that, he coughed. As the bubbles from his breath exhaled, Kurt felt an immediate and desperate need for oxygen. He was drowning. He fought frantically through the many layers of sinuous vegetation to reach the surface of the pool, leaving Shannon and his friends below. The changes in water pressure were extreme, the suffocating fluid and bubbles that surrounded his body disorientating. When Kurt finally reached the top, he burst through the surface, gasping for air. His body was buzzing all over. His arms and legs felt very heavy, and he was nearly too tired to swim to the pool's edge. He lifted himself slowly from the pool. As he looked back, the light underneath faded until there was nothing to see but dark, murky water. After leaving the water, his body was assailed with cold air. Kurt scrambled to get dressed. He was scared, and now deeply embarrassed by the whole situation. Andy and Richie were nowhere in sight. Neither was Shannon. But young Kurt was very frightened. He gathered all his strength and rode home without looking back. In the morning, when his life energy returned, Kurt felt incredible. He reminisced about what had happened at Mr. Chu's pool over his cornflakes. But then he started to have some doubts. In an effort to gain reassurance that he had only been dreaming, he looked outside the window. There sat his bike, lying carelessly in the front yard, right where he had left it last night after racing home. His stomach buzzed with excitement. It wasn't a dream. Kurt was no longer a virgin. He really did have sex with Shannon Maguire, and it was amazing. So amazing, all he could think about was telling everyone about it, and doing it again as soon as possible. As Kurt showered, he noticed many red spots on his body. They looked like zits, but smaller. The water stung mildly when it made contact with his blemishes. Kurt attributed the rash to the slimy pool water, which must have caused a breakout. Kurt roamed the high school halls proudly that morning, asking everyone he met if they had seen Andy or Richie. No one had seen them, not even their homeroom teacher, who noticed they hadn't reported. Kurt's feet were now itching badly. He stopped to scratch them when he noticed Shannon and her friend Melody approaching. Kurt stood up slowly, expecting acknowledgement, but got none. Then he approached her, smiling. She smiled back, but didn't stop to talk. "Shannon." Both girls stopped and turned to him quizzically. "It's me, Kurt. We were together last night," he said, reaching out to her. Shannon looked very confused as he continued. "I had an amazing time." Kurt got very close, practically pinning Shannon to the lockers behind her. His hands gently caressed her hair as he leaned over to kiss her. Her eyes opened wide, and she ducked defensively, pulling herself away.
Ew! What the fuck?
Shannon's eyes were now filled with outrage.
What the hell do you think you're doing? Oh, God!
She yelled woefully for all to hear. She paced backwards, moving away from him as tears filled her eyes. Melody smiled, still shocked by Kurt's audacity. Her mouth was agape with disbelief.
Oh my God! Get away, you loser!
She said ruefully. It was then Kurt realized that he hadn't gotten high with David Bowie either. His embarrassment was so total that without thinking, he turned and ran as fast as he could, bursting out of the school's double doors and all the way home without stopping. After running for over 3 miles, a feat Kurt had never accomplished at any other time in his life, he retreated to his room in tears. His feet were now burning and itching badly. He pulled off his shoes and socks, which seemed to help a little. He discovered that the soles of his feet were covered with the same type of red blemishes that he found on his arms and back. He made his way hastily to his mother's bathroom, where she had a large magnifying lens on a retractable stand used to apply makeup. Kurt sat at the countertop and folded his leg to put his feet up. He then looked at his foot through the lens. The red blemishes were much coarser than those on his back, almost wart-like. They even appeared to be pulsating, moving on their own. Upon close inspection, he could see what appeared to be little holes in the bumps that looked like tiny mouths gasping for air. Something alien was growing on his body. Kurt's heart raced. His terrible loathing and embarrassment at school was now forgotten. All he could feel was terror. He feared for his friends. Kurt called Richie's house first, but just got the family answering machine. Then he called Andy's house, and Andy's mother answered frantically. Kurt could tell she had been crying.
Mrs. Katz?
Kurt asked sheepishly.
Who is this? Who are you? Where is my son?
She demanded. Kurt's stomach shot up through his throat and he vomited. His feet were tingling violently, and it chilled him to know what was causing it.
Hello? Please bring me back my son.
He could hear Mrs. Katz plead from the distant receiver. Kurt was certain his friends, Andy and Richie, were still down there, underneath the water, breathing in the moss. He hung up the phone, got back on his bicycle, and returned to Mr. Chu's pool house. Returning to the scene was surreal. A misty fog hovered over the neighborhood, dampening the street with a cold drizzle. Kurt stood outside the wooden gate, trying to gather the courage to go back in. He felt like something knew he was coming, and it awaited his return. An older woman approached. She was jogging down the road with her Walkman on. Kurt waved her down. Lady, please.
What?
She asked defensively, removing one earpiece.
Do you live in this neighborhood?
Kurt asked desperately.
Yes, why?
Her eyes squinted.
I thought I heard gunshots in there.
Kurt lied, pointing to the fence before him.
You mean in Glenn Chu's house?
Yeah, this one, right here. Please, call the police, he demanded. The woman ran briskly to her house 2 doors down. She looked back suspiciously after she unlocked the door. Then she entered quickly, slamming the door behind her. Kurt was unsure if she'd do what he had asked, but it made him feel better knowing there was at least a small chance help was on the way. Kurt jumped deftly over the fence. He felt guided and pulled as if by gravity. He opened the pool house door. A glimmer of light emerged from the deep end, and steam drifted skyward once again. He approached the bag from whence the moss grew. Stems of some flowering plant behind seemed to wave intelligently. Kurt backed off. Andy! Richie! Are you guys down there? He yelled at the pool. He came around to the shallow side and reached down to the staircase. He felt the moss, and then it felt him back. Kurt felt a soft hand grab his. He looked up to see Shannon, holding his hand, smiling. She was topless, and with even larger pink breasts, protruding from the water.
Hey, Kurt. Come on in. Let's do it. Now.
She smiled mischievously. Kurt pulled his hand away. The slime poured off, but tiny green tentacles remained, dangling from his forearm. He pulled them off like leeches. Shannon persisted. She slinked up out of the water, her perfect body glistening in the gooey water.
Don't you want me, Kurt?
Kurt backpedaled, much as the real Shannon did from him earlier that day at school. His back pressed up to the wall of the pool house. He breathed in deeply, slid to the floor in a crouched position, closed his eyes, and prayed. The door to the pool house burst open soon after. 2 local cops yelled out at Kurt.
Freeze!
After the pool had been drained and searched, much was discovered within, including the corpses of the entire Chu family, their missing Shih Tzu, several other cats, dogs, and rodents from around the neighborhood, and the 2 boys, Andy and Richie. After the initial police investigation, it was determined in police forensic laboratories that these people had been devoured of essence. They had been eaten slowly in a fantastic virtual reality until digested by an intelligent, mammal-eating moss. This deep-water vegetation reproduced using its victims' adrenaline. It could feed oxygen to victims through its tentacles in order to keep them alive while producing the adrenaline. This was achieved by way of a highly advanced psychosexual stimulus. During his subsequent research, Dr. Sung read of accounts within Chinese folklore of a prostitute plant, which had potent sexual powers and could be dangerous if not controlled. The study also found the mossy creature could survive deep under the surface of the ocean, creating possible explanations for mythological beings such as harpies and mermaids. Kurt was never the same after his experience with the moss. To move on with his life meant forgetting all about his blissful night with Shannon, and all other fantastic possibilities that lay there with her underneath.